In the middle of Hector Bellard's barn, a woman stood with her back to the plank wall, while 7 men decided she was not worth the trouble she carried. The first one asked about her father's situation and walked away before she finished answering. From the cider barrel, her father watched, glass in hand, the way a man watches a hand of cards he has already lost. He had put her name on the table with the rest of what he owed. The second man heard her name and closed his face like a door. She counted the stones as they dropped. 3, 4. The fifth never came close enough to speak. A low laugh rose from somewhere near the stacked grain sacks and died just as fast. The cold from the mountain pass found the gap between her coat and her wrist. She did not move to close it. Her father set the glass down. The sound was too loud. He started to say her name across the room, then stopped when he saw who was still watching. The sixth man turned his horse before he reached the barn door. She stood very still and waited for the seventh. The wind outside pushed at the doors. They did not open yet. She stood in the middle of that barn. 7 men looked her over and walked away, one by one. Like she was a door they'd already decided not to open, Eliza Voss counted every single one. Not because she wanted to, because her brain wouldn't stop, wouldn't let her pretend she hadn't noticed. Hadn't felt each one like a stone dropped into still water. 7 stones, 7 ripples. One woman standing very still so nobody could see the water moving. The barn belonged to Hector Bellard. He owned the general store, the feed depot, and roughly half the debt in Cold Hollow. Every November, before the deep winter locked everyone inside for months, he opened his barn to what the town politely called a social gathering. Everyone knew what it really was, a market, not for cattle, not for grain, for people. Specifically, for women who needed husbands and men who needed wives. In a territory still young enough and wild enough that winter, without a partner, wasn't inconvenient. It was dangerous. It was sometimes fatal. So every year, before the worst cold came down from the mountains, the unmarried gathered in Bellard's barn, and the community watched and quietly decided who would survive the season and who wouldn't. Practical. The frontier had no room for romance. Eliza understood this. Had understood it since she was 17 and watched her older sister Clara get chosen by a man from the valley and ride away to a house with solid walls and a husband who didn't drink. She had understood it every single year since. This was her 8th gathering. She had never been chosen. The dress was clean. She'd boiled it twice and pressed it with a flat iron heated on the cook stove. And it was still 3 years old, and the fabric had thinned at the elbows, and the hem had been let out so many times it was starting to pull at the thread. Her dark hair, pinned up, looked almost elegant if you didn't look closely. Her eyes were brown. Her cheekbones were the kind that came from not quite eating enough, rather than from fine bone structure. She looked like exactly what she was. A 25-year-old woman who had worked too hard for too long and had very little to show for it. Behind her, through the thin wall, she could hear her father moving through the main room of the cabin. The clink of glass, the scrape of a chair, the silence that followed a long swallow. She picked up her coat, mended at the collar, missing one button, put it on. The first man was a farmer from the South Valley. He came to her around 8 o'clock, with his hat in his hands and a prepared expression. The expression of a man who had already made his decision and was delivering it as kindly as he could manage. He asked about her father's situation. She told him the truth. He nodded, slowly, said he had a good operation going. 200 acres, solid cabin, new well dug last spring. Said he needed someone who could bring something to the arrangement. She understood perfectly. He was telling her that her father's debts made her a liability. That marrying her meant inheriting a problem he hadn't caused and couldn't fix. He tipped his hat, walked away. Stone number 1. The second was a miner from the North Claim. He asked her name, heard it. His expression closed like a door someone had just decided to lock. He wished her a good evening, moved on. Stone 2. The third was a stranger from somewhere north of the territory line. He spoke to her for nearly 20 minutes about soil quality and crop yields, and what a man needed in a frontier wife. Then he said quietly that he'd heard some things about her family situation, and he needed a woman who could bring land or resources. Then he tipped his hat, stone 3. The fourth man never came to her at all. She watched him walk to where her father stood near the cider barrel. Watched them talk. Watched the man glance once across the room in her general direction. Then watched him turn away without ever crossing the floor. Stone 4. By the fifth rejection, she had stopped feeling the individual ones. They had merged into a single, continuous weight, pressing down behind her sternum. The son of the man who owned the hardware store. 22 years old and spotty-faced. He looked at her once. Found somewhere else to be. Stone 5. The sixth was a widower from the Eastern Properties who came close enough that Eliza thought for one foolish moment that something was finally different. Then a woman leaned in and said something close to the widower's ear. His face changed. He redirected himself toward the center of the room. Stone 6. The seventh was just a space, where a person should have been. Wasn't Stone 7. She was almost at the punch table when she heard it sound low, brief. From somewhere to her left, a laugh, not a loud one, not a cruel one. The kind that gets swallowed almost immediately by someone who knows better, but not quite quickly enough. Someone somewhere in that barn found this funny, found her funny. That was what broke something, not the rejections. She had built calluses over those, layer by careful layer, year by careful year. But that sound, that small, barely contained sound of someone watching her stand here and be passed over and finding entertainment in it. Eliza straightened her back, lifted her chin, walked deliberately toward the punch table like she had intended to be there all along. She would not stand against that wall and be a show for anyone. She poured herself more cider. Her hand was steady. She was very proud of how steady it was. Her face felt carved from the same cold stone as the mountains outside. She stared at the wall in front of her and breathed and told herself that every minute that passed was 1 minute closer to being able to go home. Then behind her, she heard two women speak in the careful whisper of people who want to be heard without technically being overheard. Can't imagine why she keeps coming back. Everyone knows no one will take her. Her father owes money to half the town. And she's not exactly. I mean, she's fine looking, but there's something about her. That expression, always staring at things like she's angry at them. Clara got out at the right time, didn't she? Before the situation got this bad, Eliza took a long drink of cider, stared at the wall, told herself that every word those women said was probably true, that the truth being said out loud didn't make it worse. It was the same truth either way. It didn't need witnesses to exist. She also believed herself. That was when the barn doors blew open. Not opened, blew open. Both panels slammed back against the barn walls with a sound like a rifle shot. And the cold came through like a living thing. A wave of November air that made every candle shudder. Set the lanterns swinging. Several women cried out. Eliza turned around. In the doorway stood something her mind took a moment to properly sort. Enormous. First. That was the first impression. The sheer physical scale of him. The way he had to turn slightly sideways to come through even with both panels wide. He was covered in snow from the brim of his hat to the heel of his boots, coated in it like he'd walked through the heart of the storm without bothering to find shelter, which was probably exactly what he'd done. Over his left shoulder he carried a bundle of wolf pelts, gray and silver and dark, 3 of them, at least each one large enough to cover a man from shoulder to knee. In his right hand he held a cloth sack that clinked with a dense metallic weight when he set it on the floor just inside the door. His face was half hidden under the brim of a battered hat and the shadow of a beard that had grown past intention into just how it is. His coat was canvas and leather and had been repaired so many times that the original material was almost beside the point. His boots left large wet prints on Hector Ballard's clean floor. He stood just inside the door and let his eyes adjust to the lamplight. The entire room was silent. Eliza recognized him before most people did. Not because she knew him personally, because she'd heard the stories. Everyone in Cold Hollow had heard the stories. The mountain man who lived past the timberline, north of where the trails ended. The trapper who came down twice a year to trade and never stayed longer than he had to. The man whose name people said the same way they said bad weather. Boone Harlan, 34 years old. Maybe. The mountains did something to a person's face that had nothing to do with age. Carved it differently. His eyes were pale gray-green, the color of winter water, and they moved through the room with the calm attention of a man who cataloged everything and trusted nothing. Hector Bellard found his voice. He moved forward, his smile arranged into the particular shape of a man who had accounts in a ledger he wanted settled. They weren't expecting him until spring, Bellard said. Boone said he'd gotten down before the pass closed. He had 3 wolf pelts and 40 pounds of standard hides, and there was the sack. Bellard's eyes went to the sack. Boone nudged it with his boot. Raw silver, he said. Off the north of Ridge. About 12 pounds. The murmur that went through the barn was immediate, involuntary. The sound of an entire room recalculating. But Boone had already stopped looking at Bellard. His eyes were moving across the room. Slow. Methodical. Taking inventory, the way a man takes inventory of a trail he's considering. He looked at the clusters of eligible women near the center. The Dalton sisters, young and pretty and surrounded by men. Jenny Marsh, laughing at something a blacksmith had said. A dozen others, all of them doing what the gathering required. All of them performing something. His gaze reached Eliza and stopped. She felt it as a physical thing, the weight of it. Landing on her like a hand on a shoulder, she didn't look away. She wasn't going to do that. Not tonight. Not after everything that had already happened in this barn. She looked back at him with the level attention she'd give a strange dog on a road. Assessing. Not afraid. Waiting to see what it would do. Something shifted in his face, not a smile. More like the recognition that happens when you find something unexpected in a familiar place. He picked up his sack of silver and walked toward her. The crowd parted for him the way water parts around a boulder, automatically, without deciding to. People stepped aside and didn't quite look at him directly, the unconscious response to something large and unpredictable moving through a confined space. He stopped in front of her, 3 feet between them, close enough that she could see what was dark on the shoulder of his coat. Dried blood, old, rust-colored rather than red. She filed that away without reacting to it. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way the other men had looked at her tonight, not evaluating her like livestock. Not running the arithmetic of what she was worth minus what she'd cost. Something different, something she couldn't name. More like the way you study a trail you're thinking seriously about taking. Interested in what it could do, Eliza's, he said, not a question. Boone Harlan, she said back. He didn't offer his hand, she didn't offer hers. They stood there in the middle of the room, with the entire barn pretending not to watch. I need a partner, he said. Someone who works without being watched. Someone who stays. She looked at him because. That was not what she expected him to say. Not the pretty words. Not the soft approach. Not the way the other men had approached her. Hedging and apologizing and making sure she understood that their rejection when it came would be entirely reasonable, just a statement, a need. Spoken directly at her. What percentage? She said. The room went very quiet. Boone blinked. First time she'd seen him do that. 40, he said. 50, she said. Of everything the territory produces. Pelts, silver, whatever else comes off that ridge. That's my price. The silence that followed was enormous, thick, the kind that presses against your ears. Not because what she'd said was inappropriate, because nobody had expected her to negotiate. Nobody expected the woman who had just been rejected 7 times in a single evening to hold her hand out, flat and name her terms. Boone looked at her. His expression gave nothing away. but she could see something moving behind his pale gray-green eyes. A calculation, an assessment, a man taking the measure of something he hadn't anticipated finding here in 10 seconds. Which felt, standing there, like 10 years. Half, he said. Ispel, final, like he'd already decided and was just announcing the conclusion. When do we leave, she said. Tomorrow. Before light, she set her cider cup down on the table beside her. She did not look at the people around her. She did not look for her father. She did not let herself feel anything except the cool, solid fact of what she'd just done. I'll be ready, she said. The walk home was cold, except for her own footsteps. She tried, during that walk, to talk herself out of it. She ran the argument every direction she could find. She didn't know this man. He lived above the timberline in a cabin no one had visited. There were wolves up there. She'd just seen the evidence dried on his coat. She was 25 years old. She had no training for surviving at that elevation. She didn't know how to trap or read snow or do half the things that keeping yourself alive on a mountain required. She could use a rifle, barely. She could work hard. She was good at working hard. Was that enough? She didn't know, but she knew what staying looked like. She knew every inch of that path. 8 years of gatherings. 8 years of standing against barn walls while other women got chosen. And she got another year of the same failing cabin, the same leaking roof, the same father who loved her in the imprecise and unreliable way of a man whose first relationship was with a bottle, and everything else came second. She knew exactly what staying looked like. And she had just decided she was done with it. Her father found her in the middle of packing around midnight. He stood in the doorway of her room with a lamp, and in the light he looked older than his years. Reed Voss, 54 years old, gray going silver at the temples, face drawn, and creased from too much weather, and too much whiskey, and too much time spent looking at the floor instead of at the people in front of him. He had been a good carpenter once. She remembered it in the way you remember something you learned very young, the abstract shape of it without the texture of the actual thing. "You're going," he said. "Yes, with Harlan." Yes, he was quiet for a moment. She kept folding things, the spare dress, her mother's bone-handled knife, which she'd kept in them of a bottom bunks for 10 years. A photograph of Clara, taken the summer before she married, both of them laughing at something off camera. Young and laughing, and not yet knowing what the years would do. "Eliza," her father said. "Don't," she said it without looking up, without heat. "The way you speak a truth you've said so many times, it's worn smooth." "Don't tell me it's not safe," she said. "You know what's not safe? Another winter in this cabin, while the roof gets worse, and the wood runs low, and your tab at the saloon gets longer. Don't tell me you need me here, because we both know what that actually means. And don't," her voice held. She made sure of it. "Don't tell me you're worried about me. If you'd been worried about me, you'd have done something about it for tech tonight." Her father's face changed, crumpled a little. The way old structures settle under their own weight. He didn't argue. He didn't have a defense for it. "He's not a safe man, Eliza," he said finally. "Not arguing. Just saying it out loud, I know." She closed the lid of her pack. "I've never actually been safe, Papa. I just pretended to be here." He stood in the doorway a while longer. Then he said something she didn't expect. "The tin box," he said. "Take the whole thing. Not just the knife." She looked at him. "There's a paper in there. Survey copy. Old. From when I did carpentry work for the Harlan family years back. I was there the day old man Harlan filed his claim on the North Ridge. Me and Judge Price both signed as witnesses." He paused. "Take it." "Why?" He looked at the floor, looked up, "Because I don't know why. But you're going up to Harlan land, and it's the only thing I have that connects me to that place, and I want you to have it." A pause. "Just take it, Eliza." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened her pack and put the tin box inside. Her father went back to his room. The lamp went with him. Eliza packed in the dark because she knew every inch of that cabin. The way you know a place you've been stuck in too long. She was standing outside at 4:30. In the morning, when Boone came down the road, two horses, one pack mule, moving through the dark and the blowing snow like a shadow that had learned how to navigate. He looked at her, standing there with her pack over one shoulder, coat buttoned to the throat, breath clouding in the cold. He gave one nod. She took the reins of the horse he indicated. Broad-chested gray, calm eyes. She put her foot in the stirrup and hauled herself up. "How long is the ride?" she asked. 3 days. If the weather holds, she looked north. The sky above the mountains was the gray-black of pre-dawn, heavy with cloud. The peaks were invisible. From somewhere up there, barely audible, came the sound of wind moving through rock and ice at speeds that had nothing to do with the still air down here in the valley. "It won't hold," she said. Boone glanced at the sky, looked back at her. "No," he agreed. "It won't." He turned his horse north. Eliza turned hers to follow. Cold Hollow fell away behind them in the dark. She didn't look back. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was. Very specifically afraid, in the way of someone who knows exactly what she's walking toward, rather than running from. But, looking back, felt like the kind of thing that would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. The mountain cold was different from the valley cold. She understood this within the first hour. The valley cold was weather. Something that happened to you. Something you endured until it passed. The mountain cold had opinions. It pressed through the gap at her collar and found the place on her left wrist where her cuff didn't quite reach her glove. It found the seam in her boot where the stitching had started to separate. It was specific and deliberate in the way that made you understand, without anyone telling you that this landscape had been here an incomprehensible amount of time, and would be here long after you were gone, and that it didn't particularly mind either way. Boone rode in front, back straight, shoulders square, moving with the horse instead of against it. He hadn't spoken since they left town. Eliza pulled her collar up and followed him into the dark, and let herself be alone with the thought she'd been avoiding since the barn. She had just agreed to spend the winter on a mountain with a stranger who was covered in dried wolf blood, a stranger who lived alone above the timbers lane and came down twice a year and was by every account she'd ever heard not entirely predictable. A stranger who had walked into a room full of prettier, younger, better-connected women and gone directly to her, who had not asked about her father's debts, who had not looked at her the way the other men had looked at her tonight, who had looked at her like she was something worth looking at. She held on to that last part. The first day broke gray and got grayer. They rode mostly in silence, the silence of two people engaged in the same physical task, finding that words would only add weight to it. The trail climbed steadily through stands of pine that grew taller and more imposing the higher they went, their lower branches buried in snow, their tops swaying in a wind that Eliza could see but not yet fully feel. Around mid-morning, Boone pulled up beside a frozen creek and let the horses drink from a narrow strip of open water along the bank. Eliza climbed down and stretched her legs and looked back down the valley. Cold Hollow was already invisible, buried under the fold of the land. "You ever been this far north?" Boone asked. He was crouched at the edge of the stream, watching the horses. "No. Anything you want to know?" Before we get above the tree line, she picked the one that had been sitting at the front of her mind since the barn. "The blood on your coat," she said. "Left shoulder. That wasn't recent, no. How long ago?" 3 weeks.
Wolves? Yes, how many?
5 came at me on the east line. She waited and she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. 3 are dead, he said. 2 ran. You're giving me the outcome, not the middle part. Most people don't want the middle part. I'm going to be living above the timberline, she said. I need the middle part. He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her, flat and direct and without drama. A pack of 5, following the east trap line where prey was easier to find. He'd been checking the 3rd station alone. They came from 3 directions, which told him they'd been tracking him for a while. He killed the first one before it closed the distance, the second while it was still mid-lunge, and the third after it had already gotten its teeth through his coat at the shoulder. "Not deep," he said. "It's healed. The other two?" "Ran after the third one went down." She looked at the stain on his shoulder and thought about what that moment would have looked like. One man. 3 dead wolves. 2 more deciding to recalculate. "You'll need to teach me to shoot properly," she said. "Can't you already? I can use a rifle. I'm not good at it." "How not good?" "Stationary target. Close range. Good day." She paused. "I usually hit it." He absorbed this, nodded once. As if that were a fact about the future he was simply accepting. "I'll teach you," he said. They made camp the first night in a hollow between 2 ridges, where a stand of dense spruce broke the worst of the wind. Boone built a fire with an efficiency that was almost uncomfortable to watch. Not fast and showy. Deliberate. No wasted movements, each step in its correct order. He had a fire-going stone rings nangled against a rock face in the time it took Eliza to unsaddle both horses. When Boone produced a cast-iron pot and salt pork and dried beans without comment and began making food, she moved to help without waiting to be asked. He let her. She noted that. The other option was to wave her back and do it himself. And that would have told her something specific about what he actually thought the partnership he'd proposed. He didn't wave her back. He moved over and handed her the salt without being asked. They ate without talking much. The fire popped. One of the horses shifted its weight in the dark behind them. "There are rules," Boone said eventually. He was looking at the fire. "Tell me, never go past the East Ridge alone, not until you know the land. The drop is hidden under snow. Looks flat, until it isn't. Okay. Never open the cabin door during a whiteout without tying off first. You lose sight of the cabin in a whiteout, you stop. You stay where you are. You don't walk blind, okay. Watch the horses. Both of them stop eating at the same time. That's not because they're full. Something's coming." He paused. "Work with the mountain, not against it, even when it costs you time or seems wrong. People die up there trying to beat it. What else?" she asked. He looked at her. The look of a man taking a moment to decide how much to say. "What about you?" she said. "Rules about you. Things I should know." A pause. "I don't make small talk," I noticed. "I'll tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. If I think you're doing something wrong, I'll say so. I expect the same. That's fair." He looked back at the fire. "I've been alone up there a long time," he said. He stopped. Started again. "I may not." Another stop. Like a man trying to describe a country he's lost the language for. "I'm not easy to be around." She looked at the fire too. "Neither am I," she said. "I've been told I'm severe." The almost smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Just barely. Severe means you don't perform things," he said. "That's useful up there." She considered this. "Filed it. Good night, Mr. Harlan," she said, and pulled her blanket around her and lay down facing the fire. "Harlan," he said. "Nobody calls me Mr. anything. Good night, Harlan." A pause. "Good night." She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and the fire, and somewhere far above them, the deep subterranean sound of the mountain, adjusting itself to the cold. She was terrified. She was more awake and present and specific than she had felt in years. She was not sure those were different things. The second and third days were harder. The trail climbed into country that had shed any pretense of being hospitable. The trees thinned, then stopped entirely, and the world became rock and snow and wind from every direction at once. Eliza's horse moved carefully, testing each step, and she let the animal work and focused on staying in the saddle and managing the cold, which by the second morning had become something she had to actively maintain awareness of. Keeping her fingers moving, her toes shifting inside her boots, her face turned away from the worst of the wind. Boone watched her without appearing to watch her. She caught him checking her position on the trail, checking her grip on the reins, with the same quiet attention he gave the rope lines on the pack mule. She didn't find it insulting. It was the same thing she would do, You check the things that need to hold. On the afternoon of the third day, coming over a ridge she'd thought was the last one and finding another one behind it, she heard Boone say, "There." She looked up, the cabin in a natural hollow, partway up a north-facing slope, tucked against a rock face that sheltered it from the worst of the west wind, larger than she'd expected. The logs were heavy and dark, with weatherproofing. The roof was buried under snow, but the structure beneath it was clearly solid. A woodshed ran along the eastern wall, packed to the ceiling with split timber. A small outbuilding stood 20 feet away, connected to the main cabin by a rope line. She recognized the rope line immediately. Navigation guide for whiteout conditions. The cabin was not beautiful, not warm-looking, not welcoming in any of the ways that word was supposed to carry, but it was solid, and it was real. Eliza Voss, who had spent several years in a cabin where the walls leaned and the roof leaked, and every winter was a negotiation with collapse, recognized solid and real as the most valuable things available. "It's good," she said. He glanced at her. "Most people say it looks like a prison." "Most people haven't spent February watching their ceiling come down," she said. Something shifted in his expression. The smallest adjustment. Like a man who has been carrying something tightly for a long time, and has found, briefly, a reason to loosen his grip. They unsaddled the horses in the outbuilding. Boone showed her the water barrel, the feed, the layout. They carried their packs to the cabin door. He lifted the heavy bar and pushed it open. Eliza walked in. Cooked stove, table, 2 chairs, shelving along every wall loaded with supplies. A narrow bed against the north wall. Another door, skins on the floor. A lamp that Boone lit immediately, and the light spread and showed her the proportions of the space and how completely his life was arranged here. Not neat for appearances, efficient for function. The organization of a man who knew where everything was in complete darkness and needed to keep it that way. "Second room," Boone said from behind her. "Slightly rough, that's yours." He paused. "I built a bunk before I came down. Should hold." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway still, head clearing the top frame by inches. Looking at a point past her left shoulder with the expression of a man waiting to see the consequences of a decision he'd already made and couldn't undo. He had built her a bunk. Before he came down. Before he'd even known she would say yes. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, came inside, closed the door behind him. The wind pressed against the walls with serious intent. The logs held. The lamp burned. Eliza stood in the middle of her new life and let herself feel, for one moment, the full weight of everything she'd left behind. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the peg by the door, turned to Boone. "Show me how the stove works," she said. "I have a feeling if I get it wrong, I'll burn the whole place down." He looked at her. The not-quite smile got slightly further than it had before. "The flu sticks in cold weather," he said. "I'll show you," and that was how it started. Not with speeches, not with promises, not with any of the gestures that beginnings are supposed to have. With a stuck flu, and a cook stove, and 2 people in a mountain cabin. At the edge of winter, learning what they'd each agreed to. The flu stuck for 4 mornings in a row, every single morning, without. Decided. This was the specific lesson Eliza needed to learn before it would teach her anything else. The trick was the angle. Not straight up, canted left. You had to catch the lip of the damper where the metal had warped from years of hard freezes. And if you pushed straight, you'd miss it every time, and stand there in the cold kitchen feeling like an idiot while the cabin temperature dropped around you. Morning 1. Straight up. Miss morning 2. Slightly left. Still miss 3. More left. The poker slipped. Her knuckle hit the iron edge of the stove box. She said a word she'd learned from her father and immediately felt guilty about it. Morning 4. She stood in front of that stove in the gray dark before sunrise. Hands already cold, breath already visible. She held the poker and she did not push. She did not try. She found the angle Boone had shown her the first night, and she waited and she felt the lip of the damper. and she applied exactly as much pressure as was needed. The flue opened, one click clean. Simple. Like it had never been difficult at all. Something in her chest settled. Just a fraction. Like a debt that had been carried for a long time and had just received its first small payment. That was how the mountain worked. She was learning this. It didn't give you anything. It made you buy it in small, specific increments. Attention, repetition, the willingness to be wrong several times before you were right. Boone was gone before she woke most mornings. She'd hear him sometimes in that half-conscious space before full waking. The particular sound of his boots on the cabin floor, the low scrape of the door bar, the cold that pressed in briefly and then got shut out again. By the time she was dressed and the fire going, he'd been out for 2 hours already, working the near trap lines while the light was still thin and blue and the animals were still moving. He came back mid-morning, sometimes with something, sometimes without. Calloused palmless punta. He would set whatever he'd caught outside and come in and pour coffee, and then look toward the bridge for 10 or 15 without saying anything at all. She learned not to speak to him during those minutes, not because he'd told her not to, because she watched him. And she understood it. He was coming back from being completely alone with the mountain for hours. He was re-entering the fact of another person in his space. He needed the time, so she gave it to him, and he used it, and then he would turn around and be present again. That was their mornings. The teaching was relentless, not cruel, not impatient, but relentless in the way the mountain itself was relentless. The way the cold didn't take days off, so neither could they. He showed her how to skin a rabbit in 15 minutes. She took 42 the first time. He didn't say anything. She tried again the next day. 31 minutes the day after that. 20. He showed her the difference between a track that was hours old and one that was minutes old. Crouching in the snow and pointing at the compression. The crystal formation along the edge. The way wind had or hadn't yet touched the inside of the print. Fox, she said one morning, crossed the deer trail. Last night, probably. Boone looked at the track, at her. Back at the track. Yesterday evening, he said. Not as late as you think. See the edge? She looked. The crystals had started to grow back inward. Earlier freeze than she'd accounted for. You're not bad at reading sign, he said, standing, brushing snow from his knee. You say that like you expected worse. I expected it to take longer. She turned to look at him. Is that a compliment? He had already started walking, so, yes. Apparently that was a compliment. She filed it away. The rifle was harder. Her instinct was wrong. She kept anticipating the shot, flinching before the trigger broke, pulling the barrel down at the critical moment in a way she couldn't feel herself doing, but could see perfectly clearly. In every hole, she punched into the snowbank 2 feet below the target. Boone set a plank against a dead pine 60 yards out. He stood behind her and said nothing while she missed 4 times in a row. Then he said, "Stop trying to make it happen." She lowered the rifle. What does that mean? You're pushing at the moment. Forcing it, that's a feeling, not an instruction. Yes, he moved around to stand beside her, not touching her, just close enough. Set everything right. Position, breath, sight line. And then you let it happen instead of making it happen. The shot has to surprise you. Even when you know it's coming, she looked at the plank. That is genuinely not practical advice. It's the only advice there is. She raised the rifle. He went quiet behind her. She breathed the way he'd shown her. In, let half out, hold. And she looked at the plank and she stopped trying to do anything except hold steady and wait. The rifle went off. The plank jumped. Right edge. Not the center, but the plank better, Boone said. 2 words. But she was learning what 2 words from him was worth. She shot the center the next day. He nodded, turned, walked back toward the cabin. She stood in the snow with the rifle and felt something that was too tired and complicated to be called satisfaction, but lived in the same neighborhood. 3 weeks in, She was checking the main room shelving for supplies when she found them behind a stack of extra candles. Letters, a bundle, maybe 8 or 10 envelopes, bound with a strip of leather, all of them addressed to Boone Harlan, care of Bellard's General Store in Cold Hollow. All of them unopened. She did not open them. She put them back exactly where she found them, but she thought about them all day. About the handwriting on the front, which she'd glimpsed for only a moment. Careful. Deliberate. The handwriting of someone who was choosing their words even before they wrote them. Someone had been trying to reach him. He hadn't opened the letters, or hadn't been able to. She wasn't sure those were different things. That evening it was just the two of them at the table after dinner. Boone was working on a piece of harness leather that had torn. She was sharpening her mother's boned hand-handled knife on the whetstone he'd shown her was the good one. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the high rocks in the specific register it used when it was in a particular mood. Not the howling register, the talking register. Lower, more sustained. Boone set down the harness. "My brother built the east wall of this cabin," he said. She held the stone still. She had learned not to respond too quickly to what he said. Sometimes the first thing was just the door opening. The important part was further in. His name was Colt, Boone said. 2 years younger. He'd be 32 now. Would be. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice even. He picked the harness back up, set it back down. Looked at the window where the dark pressed against the glass. "There's a man named Silas Drummond. Out of the South Valley, 63 years old, and he's been building his operation down there for 30 years. Freight company. 2 ranches. And he has a contract for timber supply to the new rail line coming 3 years. He paused. The North Ridge is directly on the rail corridor," he said, "and there's silver in it. My father filed the claim 15 years ago. Drummond has wanted it since the rail plans were announced. He tried to buy it for 4 years. Colt kept saying no, his jaw tightened slightly. So Drummond found another way. He had friends in the territory office. Papers got filed. A claim backdated. 15 years of Harlan family land. And suddenly there was documentation saying it had never been properly registered. And Colt went down to fight it, 3 weeks in the valley. Dealing with lawyers and clerks and the people at the territory office who were supposed to care about things like the truth. He turned the leather over in his hands. He never came back. What did the report say? Ice on the road. Horse went down. Flat voice. Very controlled. That's what the report said. She waited. "I've never believed it," he said. The silence that followed had weight. The kind of silence that something has been sitting in for a long time. 7 years, she said quietly. 7 years, and you've done nothing. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. She needed to understand. "I've held the ridge," he said. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not." She thought about what that looked like. 7 years of holding a position alone. Because you had no evidence and no partner, and going down with a rifle would just make you the next body on a road somewhere. 7 years of being right about something and having nowhere to put it. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said. She didn't add anything to it. It didn't need anything added. He nodded once. Picked the harness back up. Started stitching, and Eliza went back to the knife and the whetstone, and the wind pressed at the walls, and the fire held against it. Something shifted between them after that night. Not dramatically. Not in any way that announced itself. But the air in the cabin was different, but the same elements rearranged. She started noticing things she'd been filing away as practical without examining their full meaning. The way he always moved between her and the open ground when they were outside together. The way he checked the harness on her horse every morning before she mounted, running his hand along the straps with an efficiency that said he'd been doing it since the first day. The way her plate consistently had slightly more food than seemed like an equal portion. She thought about saying something. She decided against it, because the mountain had its own language. She was learning it, and one of its central words seemed to be this: let people show you things without making them explain it. She got her first rabbit on a morning in the third week of December. She'd set the snare herself, in a location she'd chosen herself, after 3 days of watching the tracks in the draw behind the woodshed. Boone had approved the general area when she'd described it, but he hadn't chosen the specific spot. She checked it alone. At first light, the rabbit was there. She carried it back to the cabin and skinned it at the table, and the time was 17 minutes. She knew because she counted. Boone looked at it when he came in. Where'd you set the snare? East end of the draw. Near the deadfall. I thought about setting one there last week. He poured his coffee. Figured it was too exposed. The run goes under the deadfall. They feel covered even when they're in the open section. He considered this, looked at the rabbit, at her, set two there next time. She did. The next morning both were full. She didn't make a production of it, but she kept it. She kept all of it. Every small increment of competence the mountain charged her for, and then delivered. The hard days came too. Days when the cold was so total and so heavy that the walk from the cabin to the woodshed felt like pushing through something solid. When her hands stopped working properly inside her gloves and she had to press them against the top of the stove and wait for the feeling to come back in increments that were more painful than the cold had been. Days when the isolation was not a quality of the landscape but an object in the room with her. Pressing, sitting in the chair across from her, staring. She missed things she hadn't expected to miss. Not the life she'd left. Not the 8 years of gatherings and the carefully managed humiliations and the endless work of holding her father's disasters together with her bare hands. But the texture of other people, the ambient presence of community. Knowing that somewhere nearby someone was doing ordinary things. She didn't say this to Boone, but one evening he came in from the East Line with a book under his arm. A battered copy of something she didn't recognize. He set it on the table beside her plate without comment and sat down and started on his food. She picked it up. He didn't look at her. She read it over the next 2 weeks, in the evenings, by lamplight, and they talked about it, haltingly at first, and then less haltingly, like two people discovering that their vocabularies overlapped in unexpected places. It helped. Then came the storm. It arrived in the third week of December, though neither of them was marking the calendar closely. It came down from the north with a quality of duration that the previous storms hadn't had. The sense of something that had traveled a very long way and intended to finish what it started. It pressed against the cabin walls with a consistency that made the logs breathe and creak. It lasted 2 full days without pause. They were locked inside together. First time, they'd had no option but to be in the same space for an extended period, without either of them being able to step outside and decompress. She learned how Boone Harlan those in 48 hours, that 6 weeks of daily proximity had only suggested. He had nightmares. She heard him once through the wall. A short, sharp sound, cut off almost immediately. The sound of someone who had taught that themselves, over years, to keep it from going further. Who had trained himself to come back from whatever was happening in his sleep before it could take hold. He drank coffee constantly. She'd known this. But during the storm it became almost meditative. The act of making it. The act of standing with it. Something to do with his hands when the work was unavailable. He could be in a room with another person in absolute silence for hours, without it seeming to bother him. This was the thing. She had not encountered this in a man before. Not once in her life. Every man she had ever spent extended time with had filled silence, with talking, with noise, with demands for attention or response. But Boone sat in a room and was simply there, complete in himself, requiring nothing from the air between them. It was like finding something cool in a place that had been chafed for a very long time. On the second afternoon of the storm, she asked him something she'd been holding. At the barn, she said, you walked straight past the Dalton sisters. Every man in that room was looking at them. He was whittling something at the table. A replacement peg for a harness fitting. He didn't look up, I know. They're younger, better connected. Their father owns 300 head of cattle, I know. So why me? He set the knife down. Looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has already answered a question and is being asked to answer it again, and has decided to do it because the person asking genuinely needs to hear it. You weren't performing anything, he said. Everyone else in that room was performing something. Prettiness, availability, suitability. You were just, he paused, seemed to be looking for it. You were just there. Like you'd stop pretending. I was having a terrible night, she said. I know, I could see that. He picked the knife back up, but you weren't falling apart. You were staying in it. That's rarer than pretty. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the storm, pushed and groaned. There was someone else, she said, before the barn. 3 years ago, he went still. Not obviously, just the slight stilling of a man choosing to listen. A school teacher. From back east, he came out here to work in the territory schools. We talked at one of the gatherings. He asked to call on me. She looked at the fire. He met my father. He didn't come back. He didn't say why. He didn't say anything. He just wasn't there anymore. The fire snapped. A log shifted. That one broke something in me, she said. Not the 7 men in the barn. That was just, I'd built up enough calluses for that. But him. Because I'd started to believe. Boone didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say she deserved better. He didn't dress it up. He said he was wrong about you. Flat. Certain. The way he stated things he'd already decided were true. He looked at him and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was being held. How do you know that? She said. Because wrong about you is the only explanation for what you described. She didn't say anything to that for a long time. Just sat with it, turned it over slowly, like a stone she'd found that might be valuable. Might just be a stone. Wasn't sure yet which. On the second afternoon, she asked him about the letters. The bundle, she said. I saw them when I was looking for the extra candles. I didn't open them. But I saw them. He stitched at the leather without looking up. Who were they from? A long pause. People from town, he said, neighbors of my father. People who knew Colt. He set the leather down. After it happened, they wrote. For the first year or two. Some of them wrote a lot, and you didn't open them. No, because he looked at the window, at the storm, doing what the storm was doing. Because reading them meant accepting that it was over, he said. That Colt was gone and wasn't coming back, and the world had kept moving, and all those people had kept living their lives and writing their letters, and I was supposed to. He stopped. I couldn't. She thought about that. So you held the ridge instead? Yes, for 7 years. Yes. She looked at the fire. I understand that, she said. He looked at her. You do. Yes. She kept her eyes on the fire. When something breaks you in a specific way, you find the one thing you can still do, and you do that instead of everything else. You do it until doing it feels like enough. She paused. It never actually feels like enough, but it feels like something. Silence. The cabin, he said. The ridge, the trap lines. That's what I could still do, yes, she said. I know. They sat in the cabin while the storm rearranged the world outside. 2 people on either side of a table. Both of them, it turned out, very familiar with doing the one thing they could still do. The wolves found her on a morning in the final week of December. She was alone with trap line. She had walked it 4 times with Boone, and twice without him, and she knew its markers well enough to run it in her sleep. She came over a ridge, and they were there, 3 of them, young, lean, in the particular way of animals that had not had enough to eat for too long, not running, standing, spread in a low, loose formation that she recognized. In some part of her brain that was operating below language. As the configuration of animals considering their options, her heart slammed into the top of her chest and stayed there. The rifle was already coming up before she'd decided to raise it. Some instruction had bypassed the thinking part entirely and gone directly to her hands. She stood very still, The wolves were 40 feet away, maybe less. The largest one, gray in the center, held eye contact with her, which was possibly the most frightening thing that had ever happened to Eliza Voss. Because that look was not random animal behavior. That was calculation. Stop trying to make it happen. She heard it in his voice, somewhere behind her own fear. Even and flat and completely unhurried, she breathed in, let half out, held. She looked at the space between her feet and the wolves. Not at the wolves. At the space, she fired into the snow 6 feet in front of her. The crack of it hit the rock face behind the wolves and came back doubled. All three animals exploded backward into the tree line. Gone before the echo finished, Eliza lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking. She stood in the snow and let them shake and breathed until they stopped, which took longer than she would have preferred. When she got back to the cabin, Boone was already there. He looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it. In order. Every detail. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The warning shot was the right call," he said. "I know, you could have panicked, I almost did, but you didn't." No. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned away. She thought she heard something that might have been a short exhale. The kind that wants to become something more and doesn't quite get there. It was the closest he'd come to a laugh. 3 days later, walking south along the tree line for a snare check, she found the reconnaissance tracks. Horse tracks. 3 sets. Recent enough that the edges were still crisp. The horses had moved along the line of the trees, from south to north, in a line that was not a hunting line and not a trapping line. She stood over them and fixed every detail into her memory. The size of the hooves, the spacing between prints, the way one horse had a slight irregularity in its right front gait, the depth of the impressions. 3 horses, 3 men, armed, probably, moving slowly and deliberately. She went back to the cabin and told Boone exactly what she'd found. In the exact order she'd found it, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was very still. "South approach," he said, "along the tree line. Moving north. They're reading the ground between the tree line and the cabin." "Yes, Drummond," she said. "Yes. He heard about the wolves. About you being hurt. Word travels. 2 traders came through last month." She looked at the window. "At the south slope. Invisible from here. But she knew where those tracks were. He'll see the injury as a window," she said. "A specific, time-limited window." She met his eyes. "We need to close it before he decides to climb through." And then came the letter. Boone found it in the bundle he'd been carrying since Cold Hollow. The letters he hadn't opened. He'd pulled the bundle out to look for something else, and one envelope fell free. Different from the others, newer, the handwriting more urgent than careful. He opened it, read it, handed it to Eliza without a word. She read, "Judge Callum Price, 71 years old, retired, a man who had, according to his own letter, been present the day Boone's father signed the original survey claim on the North Ridge, who had co-signed as witness, who had, for 7 years, watched what Drummond filed with the Territory Office and known that it was not what he had witnessed being signed. I am not a young man, and my health is not reliable," the letter said. "If someone intends to do something with this, the time is now, not next spring." Now the letter was dated 11 weeks ago. Boone had collected it at Bellard's store the morning they left Cold Hollow, tucked it into the bundle with the rest, and carried it up the mountain unopened. Eliza set it down on the table. "He may already be gone," Boone said, "or he may not." She reached into her pack, pulled out the tin box her father had pressed on her the night before she left. She opened it now, the bone-handled knife, the photograph of Clara, and under those, folded, a survey document, old, the paper gone amber at the edges, 2 signatures at the bottom, one in careful carpenter's script, "Reed Voss." Witness one in a different hand, the hand of a man accustomed to making things official. "Callum Price, witness." And at the top, in the particular formal language of territory filings, the original claim, North Ridge, Harlan family land, Eliza set it on the table beside the letter. Boone looked at the document. At her. Your father, he said. He did carpentry work for your family when I was small. He was there the day your father filed. She smoothed the edge of the paper. He didn't know it would matter. He just kept it because it connected him to work he'd been proud of. Boone was quiet for a long time, looking at that paper. He was there, he said finally. Reed Voss. I didn't know that. He didn't either, she said. Not what it was worth. He just knew enough to tell me to take it. She thought about her father standing in the doorway with the lamp, hand shaking, saying take the whole tin box, not knowing why. Just knowing. Maybe he'd known more than he'd said. Maybe he'd known exactly enough. Boone reached out and touched the edge of the document, just the edge, like he was checking to make sure it was real. Spring, he said. Spring, she said. We take this down, we find Price. If he's still there, we walk into that office with 2 witnesses and a document, and we don't leave until it's settled. The last time someone went down to settle it was alone, she said. And none of what we just found existed then. He looked at her. We go together, she said. That's different. He was quiet for a long time. Then, with the look of a man closing a door on a room he's been standing in for 7 years, deciding, at last, that he can leave it. Together, he said. On the 23rd of December, Boone didn't come home. He left at 5 in the morning. Standard schedule. East trap line, back before noon. 1 o'clock, nothing. 2 o'clock, nothing. The light was already beginning to pull back from the sky. Eliza went to the window, his tracks. Going east, and then the tracks changed. Shorter stride, uneven, the right print deeper than the left. And around his tracks, overlapping them, the widespread pads of wolves. Not one set, multiple. She stood at that window for approximately 3 seconds. Then she was moving everything she had. Every layer. Gloves over liner gloves. The wool scarf. The grease on her exposed skin that Boone had shown her was not optional above certain temperatures. Phrasing it exactly that way. Rifle. Full. Extra cartridges in the inside pocket where they wouldn't freeze. The lantern. Oil checked. She knew the east trap line. She had walked it 6 times. She knew the markers. The split pine at the trailhead. The frozen creek crossing. The long traverse across the upper slope. The draw. She knew it the way you know a route you've taken in darkness and arrived at safely and told yourself you could take again. You went. The cold outside was immediate and personal. It found every gap, every seam. The place at her left wrist where her cuff didn't sit quite right. It was not particularly interested in being fair about it. She kept moving, the split pine. Good. The frozen creek, solid enough. She crossed it without breaking through, the upper slope. She climbed it with her head down and her weight forward. Then she saw his tracks change again. The stride shortened, one print deeper than the other, and around his tracks, overlapping them, the wide, spread pads of wolves. Said multiple, she said something out loud to nobody. One word, and then she moved faster. She found him in the shadow of the east ravine wall. On his side in the snow. He had managed to drag himself partially under the overhang of a rock shelf. Some working part of him had known to get out of the wind, even when the rest of him wasn't making decisions. His coat was torn through at the left shoulder and upper arm. Torn the way teeth tear, not a cut. Teeth dark stains in the snow, some older, some not. She was on her knees beside him before she finished registering all of it. Boone, her hand on his face. Cold, deeply cold, but not the cold of a man already gone. The cold of a man who has been lying in the snow for too long and still in there somewhere. Fighting it, his eyes opened, slowly, not fully, glassy, but they found her face. Go back, he said, voice wrong, low and rough and imprecise. Stop talking, she said. Already moving, hands on the damage. Assessing, Eliza. I said stop. The shoulder was the worst of it, deep through the coat and the layers beneath. His right leg had a separate wound lower down, less severe, she thought. She wasn't sure. He was conscious, but approximately. The kind of consciousness that comes and goes on its own schedule. She looked at the terrain, the draw, the slope, the distance back. Then she looked around the draw until she found what she was looking for. The freight sled, small, used for heavy catches from the far lines. One runner was broken, one intact, the platform solid. She went to it and dragged it back, and it was heavier than she'd expected. And her arms screamed about it, and she kept moving. "This is going to hurt," she told him. "I know," he said, which meant he was tracking well enough to follow what she was doing. Best information she'd received in 20 minutes. Getting him onto the sled. Took everything she had, and then some things she didn't know she had. He tried to help. His attempts to help were more hindrance than assistance because he couldn't control his left arm. Twice she had to stop and breathe and reset before trying again. But she got him on it, on his back. She looped the rope across his chest, and under his arm she took the rope, put it over her shoulder. Leaned, the sled didn't move. The broken runner caught and skipped. His weight was wrong for the balance. The draw ran slightly uphill toward the cabin direction. Slightly. In normal circumstances, you wouldn't notice it. In these circumstances, it was everything. She put the rope over both shoulders and leaned into it the way she'd seen horses lean into heavy loads. Her whole body weight against the resistance. Not her arms. Her whole self. The sled moved 6 inches. Then another 6. Then it found a groove where a previous passage had compressed the snow, and it moved a full foot, and she was walking. Slowly. One step, then the next. The rope over her shoulders. The lantern in her right hand. The dark coming down. She did not think about the distance. She had learned this from the mountain. You don't think about how far the end is. You think about the step you're on, and then the next one. You break the impossible thing into the smallest possible piece, and you do that piece, and then the next one. Boone said her name once. About 20 minutes in, she said, "I'm here," without stopping. He didn't say anything else for a while. She was grateful. She needed everything she had for the ground under her feet, and the rope and the lantern, and reading the terrain in the dark. The wolves came on the upper slope. She heard them before she saw them, not howling. The soft, purposeful sound of animals moving through snow. Which is worse? She stopped, turned, raised the lantern, 2 of them at the edge of the light. Eyes catching gold in the dark, she had the very specific thought that these might be 2 of the 3 from the week before. Come back with a different calculation now that there was blood in the air and a wounded man on a sled. She set the lantern down in the snow. She unslung the rope from her shoulder. Her hands were not steady. She acknowledged this, cataloged it, did not let it be the thing that decided what happened next. She brought the rifle up, put the sight on the larger of the 2 wolves, breathed in, let half out, held, did not try to make it happen. The rifle went off. The wolf dropped. The second one ran. Eliza stood in the dark and listened. The wind coming harder now from the north. She needed to move. She slung the rope back over her shoulders and pulled. She could not tell you, afterward, how long it took. Her memory of it was not linear. A series of images with the connective tissue missing. The lantern light on the snow. The rope burning through the shoulders of her coat. The sound of Boone's breathing, which she listened for at every stop to confirm it was still happening. The wind coming up. The moment when she couldn't feel her hands and had to look at them to confirm they were still holding the rope line. She almost walked past it, dark in the dark. The faint ridge of accumulated snow along the length of it caught the edge of the lantern light and stopped her. She grabbed it with both hands, followed it to the outbuilding, then to the cabin door. She got the bar up. She didn't know how exactly. Got the door open, got him inside. She could not lift him off the sled. Her arms had nothing left. She got blankets from the narrow bed and piled them on the floor and cut the rope across his chest. Because she couldn't feel her fingers well enough to untie it, she rolled him off the sled, onto the blankets, not gently. She couldn't help that. She got the fire going. The return of feeling in her hands was one of the worst things that had ever happened to her. The blood coming back felt like being taken apart incorrectly and assembled with the parts in the wrong positions. She clenched and unclenched and breathed through her nose and kept working. She got his coat off him. The wound was worse than she'd been able to see outside in the dark. Deep across the shoulder and down the upper arm, still bleeding, slowly, consistently. She had watched Boone treat 2 wounds since they'd been on the ridge. Once a deep cut from a trap mechanism, and once frostbite damage on his left heel. She had watched carefully because she had understood each time that this knowledge was not academic. She went to the shelf. Carbolic, needle and thread, clean cloth. She brought them back, knelt beside him on the floor. "This is going to be worse than the sled," she said. "I know." He was more present now. The warmth of the cabin working on him, his eyes on the ceiling. Focused. The expression of a man applying everything he had to staying still and staying conscious. "You can tell me if I'm doing something wrong," she said. "I will." She poured the carbolic. He made a sound. Brief, immediately contained, jaw tight. Hands flat and pressing against the floor. She worked fast but not carelessly. The stitching was not elegant. She didn't have the angle or the training for elegant. But it was tight and even, and when she tied it off, she knew it would hold. She worked for over an hour. When she finished, her back ached from kneeling, and her hands were shaking, not from cold. She sat back on the floor beside him and looked at what she'd done. Boone turned his head and looked at her. His face had the gray quality of a man who'd lost blood and was running low on everything. But his eyes were clear. "Tracking, you came out in that," he said. "Not a question." "You didn't come back," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I told you to leave me. I know you did. I meant it. I know you did." She pushed herself to her feet, slowly, because her legs had their own objections. She moved to the stove to check the fire. She could feel him watching her. She let him, because there was nothing to hide at this point. And she was too tired to try anyway. "The wolves," he said. "2 of them. I got one. The other ran. The sled. There wasn't another way to move you." "How far?" "The full draw. Most of the upper slope." She turned to face him. "It took a while," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, at her hands, where the rope had marked her palm dog lines, at her face, which she imagined looked like what the inside of her felt like, worn down to the structural parts. Nothing decorative left. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again, stopped. Shh. She had learned by now that when he did this, it was not because he had nothing to say. It was because the sentence he'd planned was not adequate for what he meant, and rather than use the wrong words, he chose silence. Which was, she had come to understand, the most honest thing he did. She pulled a chair close to where he lay, sat in it, because her legs were done and the floor was cold. Outside, the wind came back, pressing at the cabin with the renewed determination of something that had rested briefly and was ready to try again. The fire held against it. The walls held. He slept eventually. The fitful way of someone in pain who is too exhausted to fight sleep any longer. And Eliza sat in the chair beside him and watched the fire and let herself be still for the first time in hours. She thought about the draw in the dark, about the rope over her shoulder and the broken sled and the wolf at the edge of the lantern light. She tried to find the moment she could have chosen differently. Gone back to the cabin, waited him out, told herself he was a man who knew the mountain. She couldn't find it, not because the choice wasn't there, but because somewhere in the last 8 weeks, in the mornings and the fires and the rifle shots and the harness stitching and the letters about Colt and the survey document and the brother who had built the east wall, she had stopped being a woman who was surviving here and had become someone who belonged here. Boone shifted in his sleep. She leaned forward and straightened the blanket without thinking about it. He stilled. She settled back. Outside, the mountain turned in its cold, indifferent night. Inside the cabin on the ridge, the lamp kept burning. He healed slowly, which frustrated him in ways he couldn't fully conceal and didn't try very hard to. The first 3 days after the attack, Boone slept more than Eliza had ever seen a person sleep. Deep, heavy unconsciousness. The kind that isn't rest. The kind that's the body doing arithmetic after a significant withdrawal from its reserves. She checked his stitches twice a day, kept the wound clean, managed the fever that came on the second night with cold compresses and the focused attention of someone who understood that this was the real danger. Not the wound itself, the infection that could follow it. The invisible enemy that killed people who had survived the visible one. The fever broke on the third morning. She knew it before she checked on him, because the quality of the silence from his room changed. From the tight, effortful quiet of a man fighting something, to the looser, quiet of a man simply sleeping. She stood in his doorway and looked at him and felt something in her chest uncurl that had been coiled for 3 days. He was sitting up by the 4th day. Too soon. She told him so. The near trap line needs checking, I said. He was at the edge of his bunk with his feet on the floor, testing whether the room would cooperate. Face the color of old ash. I checked it yesterday, she said. 2 rabbits and a fox. They're in the shed. He looked at her. You went to the east draw, the near line. Not the draw. I know the difference. She set a cup of coffee on the shelf beside him, within reach, but not handed to him. Because she'd learned he didn't like things handed to him in the windows when he couldn't fully refuse them. It was a dignity thing. She understood dignity things. Drink that, she said. And don't try to stand up yet. The shoulder's closed, but the leg isn't finished. If you tear it open, I'll be annoyed. He looked at her with the expression he got, sometimes, when she said something that landed differently than he'd been bracing for. A small recalibration. Visible for just a second before he settled it back to neutral. He picked up the coffee. You set 2 snares in the deadfall? He asked. 3. The middle run had fresh sign. Were they full? 2 of 3. She turned back to the main room. Drink your coffee, Harlan. She heard something behind her that was the quietest possible version of a laugh. He was on his feet the day after that. Still too soon, but negotiable. She got him to agree to main room only. No outside. By the argument that if he tore the leg wound in the cold, she'd be stitching it again. And they both knew how she felt about the stitching. He sat at the table and worked on equipment repair for hours at a stretch. The close, detailed work she originally thought his hands were too large for. She watched him across the cabin and realized the clumsiness with the small needle had been about hurry, not about limitation. When he took his time, his hands were precise, deliberate. Like everything else about him, on the 6th day, he went outside. She watched from the window. He walked to the woodshed and back, steady but careful on the leg. She could see him taking inventory as he walked. Wood levels, condition of the rope line, state of the outbuilding roof. He came back inside without her having to call him in. Stood at the stove and poured coffee. You moved the snares on the west run, he said. The creek shifted under the ice. The old locations were wrong. Where'd you put them? She told him. He thought about it. That's better than where I had them, he said. She didn't make anything of that, but she kept it. The recovery period had a quality she hadn't anticipated. Forced proximity, both of them in the cabin for most of each day. They talked more than they had before. Not constantly. Not in the effortful way of people trying to fill silence, but in the way that happens when 2 people have stopped performing normalcy for each other and have arrived somewhere more honest. He told her more about Colt, not the facts. She had those, but the texture of it, what his brother had actually been like. How Colt had been the one who could negotiate, who could read a room, who could charm a territorial clerk or a suspicious neighbor. How the family operation had worked as a unit, and how losing Colt had collapsed. Not just the personal grief, but the entire functional architecture of what they'd built together. He would have liked you, Boone said one evening, not looking at her, working at pieces of leather. He liked people who said exactly what they thought. Most people don't actually like that, Eliza said. He wasn't most people. She thought about the brother she'd never met, who had built the east wall of this cabin, who had gone down to a valley full of lawyers and not come back, and about the man sitting across from her who had reorganized his entire existence around the hole that left. "Tell me everything about Drummond," she said. Boone set the leather down, looked at the fire. "Silas Drummond is 63 years old," he said. "He's been building his operation in the South Valley for 30 years. He owns the freight company, 2 ranches, and the contract for timber supply to the new rail line coming through in 3 years. The rail line runs through the North Ridge corridor. Yes, and the silver deposits under that ridge would be worth an enormous amount to a man who already owns the freight operation that moves the ore. So it was never just about the land. It was never just about the land. What kind of man is he?" "Personally, Boone's jaw is what he can," he said, "and eliminates what he can't buy, and keeps his hands clean while other people do the eliminating." A pause. "He has 4 men who work for him permanently. Not ranch hands." She understood what that meant. "He'll hear about the wolves," she said. "He'll hear you were hurt. Word travels with the winter traders. When it reaches him, he'll see a window." She met his eyes. "He's been patient for 7 years. Patient men act quickly when they see the window close." The silence that followed was the active kind. The kind that already contains the next 10 moves. "How long since he made a move?" she asked. 2 years. Small things. Someone on the South Trail I didn't recognize. Tracks near the east approach that weren't a trapper's tracks." He paused. "He's been waiting for me to be weak." "Well," she said quietly, "now he thinks you are." She started laying the traps the next day. Not snares. Deadfalls. The mountain variety. Heavy log arrangements on pressure plate triggers that would drop significant weight onto anything that activated them. Boone had shown her the design in the first weeks as a way of managing large predator incursions. She had watched carefully, the way she watched everything he showed her, that she understood she would one day need to use without him. That day had arrived somewhat ahead of schedule. She worked alone, while Boone was still limited in his mobility, moving through the South Approach corridor in the early mornings, making adjustments to the terrain that wouldn't read as adjusted to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. The narrow section at the first switchback of the South Trail, that was the primary position. The place where the ridge walls came close enough on both sides that anyone coming up on horseback would be committed before they could see the cabin clearing. She told him what she'd done each evening. He listened and said things like, "Move it 6 feet north," or "the trigger needs to be higher," or "a horse will set it off too early." And she filed the corrections and went back in the morning and adjusted. The east approach she handled differently. There was a section of the east draw where the trail ran between 2 snow shelves that had been building weight all winter. Boone had always walked carefully under them. She didn't destroy the shelves. Destroying them would be obvious. Instead, she cleared the anchoring brush from the lower shelf. Quietly, leaving everything looking untouched. The weight was still there. But the anchor wasn't. The West Ridge route, she said on the 4th evening of planning. Boone looked up from the map. "I told you, it's nearly impassable. In winter, nearly," she said. "If someone sends an experienced man up the west route to flank while the main group comes south, they'll expect it to be clear. They won't expect anyone to have been up there." "When did you?" "Yesterday morning." She met his eyes. "I left at 4, back by noon. I set 3 deadfalls on the critical section and packed fresh snow over the trail surface. It looks solid." "It isn't." He stared at her. "That section is." He stopped. "That's a 5-hour round trip in current conditions." 5.5, she said. "I left early. It was quiet for a long moment. You should told me before you went. You'd have tried to come." "Yes." "You're not ready for 5 hours. Deep snow on that terrain." "Eliza, I know the route. I walked it twice with you. I knew every marker." She kept her voice even. "Not defensive. Just accurate. I wasn't reckless." A long pause. "No," he said. Finally, like he was confirming something from his own records, rather than deciding it new. "You're not reckless." He also told her something during those planning sessions that mattered. There was a clerk at the territory office, a woman named Mabel Strand. She'd been there since before Colt went down. She knew the original filings. Colt had mentioned her in the last letter he'd sent Boone. You think she'd help? I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right question. I think she knows what Drummond's filing said, and what it should have said, and nobody has ever walked in there with evidence and asked her to compare the two. Eliza pulled the planning back to Boone's blind spot. She did it carefully and more than once. 7 years of carrying his brother's death had done something specific to his judgment about Drummond. Made it too personal, too heated in the places where it needed to be cold. He kept framing Drummond's next move in terms of what Drummond deserved, rather than what Drummond would actually do. You keep thinking about what he deserves, she said on the third night of planning. We need to think about what he'll actually do. Those aren't the same problem. No, and only one of them keeps us on this ridge. She met his eyes. We don't have to beat him in a fight. We have to make the North Ridge inaccessible, long enough for spring to come. And when spring comes, we go down with the survey document and Judge Price's letter, and we walk into that territory office, and we don't leave until it's settled. The territory office, he said. The flatness in his voice that came when something got too close to what had happened to Colt. No, she said, but the legal route is what he used on your family. And it's what he'll try to use again. If we don't play it, we're just two people on a mountain with rifles and no standing. She held his gaze. Colt went down alone. We go together. With everything documented. That's different. A long silence. Together, he said. Finally. And it sounded this time less like a word and more like a decision. She spent 3 more days expanding the defensive positions after that. 2 additional deadfalls on the South Trail. She reinforced the east approach separately. And she added one more thing Boone hadn't suggested. A series of shallow trenches beneath the snow along the south approach, running perpendicular to the trail, invisible under the surface, not dangerous to people on foot. But they would slow horses, make them uncertain, make riders work to control their mounts. In a confrontation where seconds mattered, that uncertainty was worth more than it cost her to create. Boone went over her work on the 10th day, walked the full perimeter, assessed each position. West Ridge position, he said when he came back. Second deadfall. Move it 20 feet south. The sight line. I know what you were thinking. 20 feet south, at the point where the arrows. Anything coming up triggers it with no room to back off. Where you have it, there's 6 feet of clear trail behind the trigger that a fast horse might make. She went back up the next morning and moved it. He was right. She didn't mind that he was right, which was, she was realizing its own kind of information. The men came on a Tuesday. Eliza knew it was Tuesday because she'd been keeping on the inside of the woodshed door. And when she looked at her marks that morning before dawn, she found it almost funny. That violence apparently kept a schedule. She heard them on the South Trail at mid-morning. Not the horses themselves, but the disturbance their passage made, the way the birds at the tree line went silent. Then the silence spread uphill like a slow wave. She went inside. South approach, she said. Boone was already at the window. He'd been at the window in intervals for 3 days. His shoulder was not right. The range of motion on his left arm was still limited. He could shoot. The shoulder didn't affect his trigger hand, but he was slower than he should have been. Less able to manage fast repositioning, and they both knew it without saying it directly. How many, he said. Can't see yet. They came into view at the south tree line, 20 minutes later. She counted. 4 riders. 1 pack horse loaded heavy. The pack horse told her they'd planned to stay, which told her what kind of visit this was. One of the men had a quality of deliberateness that read differently from the rest. The posture of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any given situation. That's Drummond, Boone said very quietly from beside her, 63 years old, medium height, compact. He sat his horse like a man reviewing a property he'd already decided was his, something almost administrative about him. The coat was too good for the terrain. Like he'd dressed for a meeting, not a mountain. He thought this was already done. Wait, she said. Eliza, wait. They don't know what I've done to the approaches. If they come straight up the South Trail, the first deadfall triggers at the switchback before they can see the cabin clearing. Boone looked at her hands on the rifle, at whatever he read in the rest of her. How confident are you in the trigger mechanism? He said. The right question, very. I tested weight on it twice. Once we commit, south window is yours, she said. Door is mine. That gives us angles on the clearing and the trail both. My shoulder. South window is yours, she said again. Flat. Final. The tone she'd learned from him. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. They moved into position. She was behind the cabin door, drawn to within 3 inches on the latch. Enough to see through, more than enough to shoot through. Boone was at the south window, crouched, his rifle across the sill. The 4 men came up the south trail in single file, horses moving carefully in the snow. Eliza watched them come and breathed slowly and did not try to make anything happen. The lead rider reached the first switchback. She heard it clearly, even from this distance, the crack of the trigger mechanism, releasing. Then the heavy, percussive crash of 300 pounds of timber dropping from the shelf above onto the trail. The lead horse screamed and reared. The man on it went sideways into the snow. The next 2 horses scattered backward down the trail in the instinctive panic of animals encountering falling things from above. Drummond's horse held. Good horse. Good control. But it danced sideways and Drummond had both hands on the reins and for the moment was doing nothing else. Now, Boone said. She opened the door. She didn't shoot at the men. She shot at the snow shelf above the switchback, the secondary position she'd identified 2 weeks ago. The shelf that had been loading with accumulated weight all winter and needed only a significant nearby impact to begin moving. Her shot hit 2 feet below the crest. The shelf released, not an avalanche, a slide. Heavy and deliberate and massive. Pushed down across the trail below the switchback, and stopping it as completely as a gate dropped across a road. The south trail was blocked. One of the riders, the man who'd been thrown from his horse, pulled his rifle and fired toward the cabin. Panicked, the shot went wide and high and hit nothing. Bond's rifle answered from the window. The man's hat came off. He threw himself behind a tree. Drummond. Boone said it from the window. His voice had stripped itself down to just the essential thing underneath. Silas Drummond. A silence from below. Then Drummond's voice came up through the cold, controlled. The voice of a man managing his situation, Harlan. I heard you'd had some trouble. Came to discuss the property question. The property question is settled, Boone said. Has been for 15 years. The Territory Office has some concerns about the documentation. You're here because you thought I was hurt enough to take. Silence. I'm not. Eliza watched the 3 functional men below regroup. She watched them read their situation. The trail was blocked. They couldn't bring the horses up. The 2 rifle positions from the cabin had the clearing covered. The man on Drummond's left started moving east. Toward the draw. She'd been watching for exactly that. The east draw is not a better option, she said. Clearly. Calmly, loud enough to carry. The man stopped. Looked toward the cabin, locating her voice. Looked at the draw. Looked back at Drummond. Who is that? Drummond said. And for the first time his voice had something in it that wasn't administrative certainty. A small fracture. The sound of a man encountering something that wasn't in his information. That's my partner, Boone said. The word landed in the cold air and sat there. Eliza watched Drummond absorb it. Watched him revise whatever he'd been told about the situation on the ridge. The injured trapper, the empty cabin. The straightforward acquisition of a position he'd been patient about for 7 years. Watched the revision fail to produce the outcome he'd come here for. We can discuss this. Drummond started. There's nothing to discuss, Eliza said. Her voice was steady. She was mildly surprised by how steady it was. You have one clear trail out, south. It's open because I left it open. That changes in 5 minutes if you're not moving. A long silence from below. There are 4 of us, Drummond said. I know, Eliza said. I set the first deadfall for 5. Another silence. Longer. She watched the man on Drummond's left look at the east, draw one more time. Assess what he could see and what he couldn't see. Make a decision based on the specific quality of what couldn't be seen being worse than what could. He said something quietly to Drummond. Drummond sat on his horse and looked at the cabin for a long moment. She could see the posture of a man recalculating a plan he'd spent years building, arriving at the conclusion that today was not the day it resolved. He turned his horse. The 4 of them went back down the south trail around the slide, single file, the way they'd come. Eliza watched until they disappeared into the trees and the sound of horses faded and the trail was empty. She held her position for another 10 minutes, watching. Then she came away from the door and stood in the center of the cabin and let out a breath that felt like it had been stored in her chest for approximately 2 hours. Boone came away from the window, moving carefully. The activity had cost his shoulder something. She could see it in the set of his jaw. But he was upright and looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. The east draw, he said. You told him it was blocked. Yes, is it? The undercut shelf, yes. He didn't test it. No, she said, he didn't. Boone was quiet for a moment. He set his rifle on the table, stood with both hands on the surface and looked at the grain of the wood. He'll come back, Eliza said, with more men and a better plan. I know, but not today, he looked up. Not today, he agreed. She sat down across from him. 2 people tired in a way that had gone past the body into something more structural. Colt would have been good at this, Boone said after a while. The planning, she heard what he meant. The specific thing he was remembering. Yes, she said, he would have. She leaned forward. Tell me about the silver deposits, she said, the North Ridge. I need to know exactly what we're holding, and exactly what Drummond knows about it. Beck, if he's coming back, we need to know what this is worth to him, down to the last ounce. A pause. Then, with the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just found at last that there is someone on the other side of the table. Sit down, he said. I'll tell you everything. Drummond came back 18 days later. This time there were 9 of them. She counted from the west window, staying well back from the glass. 7 riders, 2 on foot already. The footmen carrying equipment she recognized at distance as survey instruments. Drummond had brought his documentation team. She understood it immediately and completely. The survey men are the real objective, she said. The riders are cover and distraction. Boone looked where she was looking. If the survey men reach the ridge, they won't, she said. The flatness of it surprised even her. Not bravado. Bravado was noise. This was quieter and more specific, the voice of someone who had already done the geometry and was satisfied with the result. She'd been watching the barometric pressure for 2 days, the specific quality of cold air holding itself before it committed to something worse. The way both horses stood in the outbuilding, not eating, which Boone had told her in the first weeks meant something coming. She'd mentioned the pressure drop when she woke. Boone was already at the window. Today, he said. She didn't ask how he knew. The riders hit the first deadfall at the switchback at 9:20. She'd reset and reinforced it after the first visit. Heavier log, tighter trigger. It released with a crack she could hear clearly from the cabin, followed by the immediate chaos of horses encountering falling weight. 2 horses went down in the snow. Men shouted. The tight trail did exactly what a tight trail was designed to do. The 2 survey men had stopped below the switchback at the sound. She watched them look at each other, look up toward the ridge, make the calculation she already knew the answer to. The south trail was blocked, but the ridge was 800 feet above them. They had equipment, they had maps, they had orders, and the open slope between here and there had no deadfalls on it. that they could see. She was already moving. East exit, she told Boone. I'll get above them on the slope, Eliza. 20 minutes. Then you deal with the trail. She was at the east exit door. 15, he said. The weather's moving faster than you think. She went. The slope above the South Trail was steep and open. She wasn't trying to be quiet. She was trying to be above those two men before they climbed high enough to see the ridge approach. She went up the way she'd learned to go up steep terrain on this mountain. Not fighting it, working with the angle. Hands in the snow on the steep sections. Weight distributed, breathing controlled. She could hear the men below her before she saw them. They were working hard, breathing hard, not accustomed to this terrain. The man in front had a transit instrument over his shoulder. The second had a sample case and a roll of documentation paper. She got above them, into the rock outcrop that jutted from the frost slope 40 feet below the ridge proper. She looked down and found them, two men, maybe 60 feet below her. Moving steadily upward, she braced against the rock, brought the rifle around, and shot into the snow slope 4 feet to the left of the lead man. The sound was enormous in the open terrain. Snow erupted in front of him and he lurched sideways into his partner, and they both went into the snow, and the transited instrument went with them, sliding 10 feet before catching on a rock. Leave it, she called down. Clear and carrying, the equipment and the samples. Leave them and go back down. The lead man scrambled upright, red-faced, looking up the slope, trying to find her. She shot again, closer. He went back down into the snow. I will not miss a third time, she said. Leave the equipment. Silence. The second man said something she couldn't hear to the first man. The first man looked up the slope, looked at the ridge above her, calculated the distance, the angle. The rifle he couldn't locate and couldn't match. He left the transit. The second man left the sample case and the documentation paper. They went back down the slope, considerably faster than they'd come up. Eliza stayed in the rocks and watched them go. Below on the South Trail, she could hear the ongoing disorder. Boone dealing with what remained of the riders. One rifle shot. Then the sound of horses moving away downhill. The wind was coming in hard from the northwest now. The first snow came while she was still on the slope. Hard, small pellets driven sideways, which meant the real storm was close behind. She descended carefully. The slope was changing under her as the new snow came in. She took it slowly, because a broken ankle on this slope in this weather was not a recovery situation, and she had not survived everything she'd survived to end that way. She reached the east cut and followed the rope line, and came through the cabin door into the heat and the smell of wood smoke. Boone was at the table. He had a cut on his left forearm. Not deep. She'd ask about it in a moment. He was sitting very still, with both hands flat on the table and his eyes on the door. When she came in, something moved across his face. Something he made no effort to manage. She stood in the doorway and let it land. Didn't deflect it. Didn't file it away for later. Let it matter to her, the way it was clearly mattering to him. Survey men are off the slope, she said. They left their equipment. Trail's clear. Drummond's men went south. Drummond too? Drummond too. Anyone. Nobody's dead, she said. Either side, he looked at her steadily. You said that matters. It does. When we walk into the territory office in spring, we need to say nobody was killed. That's a different story than the one Drummond will tell. She came inside and closed the door. The storm arrived against the walls a minute later. All at once, committed. The sound of everything the Northwest had been building for 2 days, releasing itself against the cab. The logs held. She stood in the middle of the room and let herself feel, for the first time in hours, the full complicated weight of what had just happened and what was still ahead. It's not over, she said. No. But today is over. He looked at her across the table. Today is over, he agreed. Spring came the way spring always comes to high country, not gently, not in one arrival, in arguments, in retreating and advancing. Warm days that convinced you, cold nights that corrected you. The snowpack softening in cycles until the balance finally tipped, and the melt became something you could trust. Thisfusa, Eliza stood outside the cabin on the first morning that felt genuinely warm, and looked the mountain, and tried to locate the woman she'd been in November somewhere. In what she felt now, she couldn't find her, not because she was gone, because she'd been built into something to a wall. Wayar gets built into a wall. Still there. Still itself, but the wall is what it's become. She had scars on both hands that hadn't been there before. Her face in the small mirror was different. Not harder, or not just harder. More inhabited, like a place that has been lived in long enough to show the living. She was 26 years old. She had survived a winter above the timberline. 2 separate confrontations with men who intended her real harm. A wolf in the dark on a slope in a storm. A fever that had wanted to take the only person on the ridge she'd come to trust entirely. And she had come through all of it with something that was not triumph. Triumph was too clean, too simple. It was more like the specific knowledge of what she was made of. Detailed. Verified. Hers. The night before they left for Cold Hollow, Boone was at the table going through the documentation they'd assembled. The survey document from the tin box, his own records of the silver deposits, the letter from Judge Price. The record she'd kept of Drummond's 2 incursions, written in the careful hand she used for things that needed to be accurate. He looked up without preamble. The half share, he said. I want to formalize it before we go down. She looked at him. We discussed this. I want it in writing, with a witness. He paused. And the cabin on the document, too. Not just the territory production. The property, Boone. You dragged me through a blizzard on a broken sled, he said. Flat. Factual. The tone he used for things he'd already decided and was done negotiating. You built defenses that held twice. You know this territory as well as I do now. You shot a wolf in the dark on a slope while carrying a man you'd just pulled across the draw. He looked back at the documents. The half was always the right number. I just need it written down so there's no ambiguity if something happens. If something happens, she said, we're going to walk into the same territory office that helped Drummond bury my family's claim 7 years ago. Yes. If something happens. She looked at him, this man who had walked into a barn full of better options and gone directly to her, who had looked at her hands and seen something that everyone else had missed entirely, who had taught her to read the mountain and shoot without flinching and make fire in the dark and trust the weight of a thing without forcing it. Shh. Who had let her sit beside him while he slept and had not pretended in the morning that it hadn't meant anything. She said, all right, write it down. I'll sign it. Something settled in his face. Not relief exactly. The specific quality of a man who has been holding something at great cost and has just found a surface solid enough to set it on. They reached Cold Hollow in the early afternoon of the second day of travel. The town received them the way towns receive things they don't know how to categorize. Word had come down through the winter. The mountain man was hurt. Someone was up there with him. Drummond's survey team had come back without their equipment. The complete picture walked into town on horseback. Eliza Voss alongside Boone Harlan. Silver samples in the saddlebags. Documentation in Boone's coat pocket. And on Eliza's face an expression that several people would attempt to describe afterward and find they couldn't quite land on. Not arrogance. Not triumph. Something quieter than either. She saw her father from a distance, Reed Voss, standing in front of the dry goods store. The slightly unfocused look of a man who had spent a difficult winter and was facing something he'd been told to expect and still didn't know how to see. His hands were steadier than they'd been in November. Not steady, but steadier. She rode to him and dismounted. He looked at her hands, at her face, at the coat that had been mended twice more since she'd left. Eliza, he said. Papa, are you? He stopped, looked at Boone, who had dismounted and was holding both horses and looking carefully at nothing in particular, giving them space. I kept expecting bad news, someone to come down from the mountain, and I didn't know if I'm here, Papa. She stood in front of him on the main street. That's news. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his arms around her. Awkward, unpracticed. The embrace of a man who had stopped being a father in any functional sense years ago, and was attempting to remember how. She stood in it and let him. Because he was her father. Because he was flawed past the point of many kinds of repair. Because none of that changed what he was. And because he had put the tin box in her hands the night she left. He had not known what it was worth. He had known enough to give it to her anyway. She stepped back. "The document in the tin box," she said. "The survey copy. Did you know what it was when you gave it to me?" He looked at the ground. "I knew it connected me to something I'd done right," he said. "A long time ago. I thought maybe." He stopped. "I didn't know it would matter." "It mattered," she said. "It changed everything." He looked up. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. "I have things to take care of today," she said. "I'll come by tonight," he nodded. Watched her walk back to where Boone was waiting. The territory registrar's office was on the main street, 2 blocks from the general store. They went directly there, the registrar, a man named Hollis, with a rigid set of shoulders, and the weariness of someone who'd been hearing Drummond's name in conversations about the Northridge for years, received them with professional neutrality. Boone laid the documentation on the desk. Eliza laid the survey maps beside it. The silver samples went on top. "We'd like to speak with the clerk, Mabel Strand," Eliza said. Hollis looked at them. "Mabel Strand has been with this office for 12 years, he said carefully. "I know," Eliza said. "That's why we want to speak with her." Mabel Strand was 45 years old, with careful eyes, and the posture of a woman who had spent years being very precise about what she said and what she didn't say. She came into the room and looked at the documents on the desk and went very still. "The original survey," she said. "Yes," Eliza said. "Where did you get this?" "My father witnessed it. He kept a copy." Mabel Strand looked at the survey document for a long time. Her hands were folded on the desk in front of her. Very still. "There's something you need to know," she said finally. And her voice had the quality of something that has been held in for a very long time and has finally found the door. "About what was filed 7 years ago. About what it said versus what the original documentation showed. Tell us," Eliza said. And she did. The hearing took 3 days. Drummond arrived on the second day. He came with lawyers. Good ones. The kind with city suits and practiced patience. He sat across the room from Eliza and Boone, with the contained expression of a man who had played long games before and expected to play this one the same way. He looked at Eliza during her testimony. She looked back. She testified once, precisely, factually, in the voice she'd been using since November. The voice that said, "I know what I saw, and I know what I did, and I am not asking you to be comfortable with it." She described the survey document, her father's presence at the original signing, the letter from Judge Price, the 2 incursions on the ridge, and what she had done to address them, the dates, the numbers, the specific mechanical details of what she'd built and how it worked. She watched Drummond's face as she spoke, watched him try to reconcile the woman with sitting in this room with whatever he'd been told about the situation on the ridge. They didn't match. She could see him recalibrating. She met his eyes without hostility, without performance. The flat acknowledgement of someone who has already won and is being generous enough not to announce it. Judge Price's written testimony was entered into record on the 3rd day. He was too ill to travel. But his statement was notarized and clear, and left no ambiguity about what he had witnessed. 15 years ago, when Boone's father filed the original claim, Mabel Strand testified as well. She was precise, careful, and devastating. Because she had 12 years of institutional knowledge and a memory for what filings had said versus what they should have said. And she had been waiting, in her own quiet way, for someone to walk in and ask the right questions. The ruling came on the 3rd afternoon. The Harlan family claim on the North Ridge, including the silver deposits, was confirmed. Drummond's backdated filing was declared fraudulent. And then the hearing officer said something that neither Eliza nor Boone had expected or asked for. The matter of Colt Harlan's death, the hearing officer said, given the evidence of the fraudulent filing and the pattern of conduct it implied, was being referred to federal authorities for separate investigation. The room was quiet. Eliza looked at Boone. He had gone very still. The particular stillness of a man receiving something he had wanted for 7 years and had stopped letting himself want because wanting it hurt too much. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, like he needed something solid. She put her hand over his, just for a moment. He didn't move, but he didn't pull away. Drummond left Cold Hollow the following morning. She heard from the freight operator's wife that he'd gone south to his other properties and did not intend to return. She received this information and felt not satisfaction, but something more specific. The particular quiet of something that has been unresolved for a very long time finally resolving. The way a joint pops back into place, briefly intense. Then just the memory of the long ache that preceded it. Hector Bellard found her outside the registrar's office on the third day, hat in hands, eyes arranged toward the ground. The posture of a man who remembers what he said about a person in November and is now standing in front of someone who has considerably more resources and standing than she had then. I understand you and Harlan have some interest in investment in the valley, he said, in the tone of a man doing something his dignity found expensive. We might, she said. The mill's been on the market 2 years. I haven't found the right buyer. She looked at him, at the hat in his hands, at the lowered eyes, at the carefully arranged face of a man, watched her. Watched stand against his barn wall and be passed over and done nothing because there was nothing in it for him to do. She could have made him stand in it. She had earned that. Come by Thursday, she said. Bring the accounts. He looked up. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, yes, but also the specific surprise of a person who has been bracing for punishment and encountered pragmatism instead. Thank you, Miss Voss. Mrs. Harlan, she said, not correcting him. Just stating the current fact. He nodded. Went away. Eliza stood on the main street of Cold Hollow in the early spring sunlight and looked north toward the mountains. The peaks still white. The passes still closed for another few weeks. The cabin up there, sitting in its hollow, waiting. She heard Boone's boots on the boardwalk behind her. Didn't turn, Bellard, she said. Saw. He came to stand beside her, not behind, beside, the way he'd been standing since December. Thursday. He'll negotiate hard. He doesn't have another buyer, and he knows we know that. But he'll negotiate anyway, because he can't help himself. Let him. A pause. You'll take him apart. I might let you do some of it. She looked at the mountains. You're frightening when you're quiet. I'm always quiet. Exactly. He made the sound beside her. The one that wanted to be a laugh and occasionally briefly became one. The stories about them started, that's spring, and kept changing as they traveled. By the time they reached the far settlements, the facts had accumulated details that neither of them would have recognized. The wolves had become a dozen. The storm had become the worst in 40 years. Drummond's men had numbered 20. Eliza heard some of the versions herself. Found she didn't mind the distortion. Distortion was how significance got communicated in a place that had no other mechanism for it. What stayed consistent across every version, the one detail that didn't change regardless of who was telling it or how far from the source, was this. The woman went out in the blizzard alone to find him. Everything else was decoration. That was the core of it, the part that people kept years later. Because there were years. Because they built them the way you build anything worth having. Imperfectly, and with interruptions, and with the specific difficulty of two people who are each fundamentally accustomed to doing things alone, learning to do them together. The cabin had been expanded, a room added, the stovepipe replaced. The woodshed rebuilt with better joinery, because Boone had decided one winter that the old one wasn't going to last and had spent 3 weeks making it right. A traveler coming through the territory would ask about the name on the official survey map. The North Ridge had been formally registered. The name on the document was the name that Mabel Strand had typed into the record because it was the name on the partnership filing. Harlan Voss Ridge the Traveler would ask. The local would tell the story, or some version of it, and the story would always start the same way. A woman stood in a barn in November. 7 men looked her over and walked away. And then the mountain sent someone who looked at her differently. Eliza heard this version once from a trader who didn't know who she was. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, without correcting it, not because she agreed with the framing. The mountain hadn't sent Boone. Boone had walked in on his own, covered in wolf blood, carrying silver. With the particular loneliness of a man who had been holding something alone for too long and had walked into a room of people performing availability and found, in the corner, a woman who had stopped performing entirely. But because the part that mattered was in there somewhere. The part about being looked at differently. The part about what happens when one person sees what everyone else walked past. Boone found her one evening at the south window, looking down at the valley. The lights of the settlements below making small gold points in the early dark. The stars coming out above the ridge. Thinking about something, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The barn, she said. He came and stood beside her. Do you regret it? He said. Not worried, just asking. Because they were people who asked each other things. No, she said. And because honesty had always been the language between them. I regret some of what came before it. The years of pretending the cabin was enough. The years of going back to those gatherings. She looked at the lights in the valley. I don't regret a single day up here. He was quiet beside her. Outside, the mountain held its silence. The old, indifferent silence that had stopped feeling hostile a long time ago and had become something like company. The constant presence of something so much larger than either of them, that their smallness had stopped being frightening and become, in a strange way, a relief. The stitching, he said. On my shoulder. She looked at him. It held, he said. Better than the professional work I had done after. A pause. I thought you should know that. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had walked into a barn like a storm and had been, in the years since, significantly more complicated and difficult, and worth knowing than any version of him she could have imagined that night. Go make coffee, she said. He did, and she stayed at the window a moment longer, looking at the valley, and the lights, and the stars, and the ridge that bore their names. Not because she had been rescued there, not because the mountain had been kind to her there, but because she had held it, had refused to let go, had walked into the hardest place she'd ever been with both eyes open and her own weight on her own back, and had found that her own weight was something she could carry. That was not the same thing as rescue. That was something harder, more permanent, more hers. She turned from the window and walked into the warmth and the smell of coffee and the specific life she had built. The mountain outside settled into its cold and patient night. Inside the cabin on the ridge, the lamp kept burning.